Hello, this is the next in a series of videos about providence, divine providence in the world and in your life and in my life. And the focus right now is on the aspect of it that pertains to security. I like to think of this as providence as pertaining to security and freedom, which happen to be the two main themes of the Cold War. The two things that preoccupied people in the United States, and I think in a lot of other countries, the most. I think back to 1957, when Soviet master spy Rudolf Ivanovich Abel was captured in New York, and my father became his court-appointed defense counsel, and I, as a 12-year-old boy, would be taken down sometimes to the prison in Manhattan where Abel was being held. Those were interesting visits. And to consider the fantastic amount of damage, including things pertaining to the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, with which this master spy was connected. And this case went up through the Supreme Court of the United States, where his conviction was affirmed. And the month after that conviction was affirmed, Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, was shot down over the Soviet Union. And these two spies were eventually exchanged. But shortly after he was shot down, the month after that, my father and I were in London. And we were in our hotel when we received a telegram, or he did, from the State Department, stating that it was all right from the U.S. government's point of view if my father met with the Soviets in Zurich, which seemed like a possibility then in June of 1960. And so that meeting didn't work out, and the trade wasn't concluded until a year and a half later. But right after we got that telegram, we went over to a meeting that we had in the Houses of Parliament with the Lord Chancellor, who presides over the House of Lords, Lord Kilmuir. And Lord Kilmuir, 14 years before that, had been known at Nuremberg as Britain's chief prosecutor at Nuremberg as Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. And my father likewise had been a prosecutor there at Nuremberg. And it was an interesting conversation in that ornate chamber of the Lord Chancellor, because despite that kind of an atmosphere, the discussion was about evil, how real, how pervasive, how dangerous it can be. And it got very specific about the kinds of evil that prevailed in the mentalities of certain people like Hermann Goering, the foremost defendant at Nuremberg. And Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, in fact, distinguished himself particularly in his cross-examination of Goering, who was denying that he knew anything about the Holocaust, whereas in fact, as Maxwell Fyfe explained very clearly, he knew a lot about it, and so did Hitler, and he exposed Goering in that cross-examination, and in fact Goering committed suicide a day or two later. That his suicide was also helped by the kind of evidence that my father was in charge of, namely the visual evidence. But anyway, this is a kind of thing that going on in history that we have to be aware of. Many people don't want to think of objective evil or an active principle of evil. And it's only when you really get into a conversation or see photographs of such things of the kind that were produced and shown at the trial in Nuremberg that you begin to believe what's going on. Or you consider that the Soviets and communists in general, according to Solzhenitsyn, were responsible for the deaths of 110 million people. You begin to realize that evil is indeed a massive and active principle. And so it was that very morning, really, I sat in on what I think of as a hinge of history because it was just shortly, really, after World War II. The Nazis had been defeated and all of that. And now a new evil was becoming very real. In other words, the intercontinental ballistic missiles were, because of what had been revealed by powers, were so real, so numerous, and so effective that England and America and other countries were in very serious danger. So you slay one dragon and another one always seems to appear. The other thing about it is that the question of reality being an objective thing, whether it's evil or not, as opposed to what we can make up by ourselves. In 1962, that exchange between Rudolph Abel and Francis Gary Powers was concluded during negotiations by my father in East Berlin with the Soviets, in particular the head of the KGB for Eastern Europe. The following year, in the summer of '63, I went over to Berlin with a friend of mine as a tourist. And I was wandering through East Berlin on my own, and a young German approached me and asked me if I was an American and whether I had had any trouble getting across the border, whether I was being searched, that kind of thing. And I said, no problem. He said, would you take this letter and mail it over in West Berlin, because if I mail it here, it won't be delivered. So, somewhat naively, I said, sure, that'll be fine, I'll just give it to me. But I got to the border, and I was arrested, put into a cell, interrogated, and left alone for a long time, to feeling very unsafe indeed, wondering, in fact, whether within a few days I would be breaking rocks in some chain gang in Siberia. But I also thought about my theme here of objective reality, because you see, the key to the negotiation with the exchange of Abel and Powers was that the Soviets were trying to pretend that Abel was an East German. So whenever the negotiations became difficult, the Soviet negotiator would say, well, we have to check with the East Germans on that point. And finally my father said, I don't want to hear any more about East Germans. We all know that if you told the East Germans to get on their hands and walk around this building, they'd get down and try to do it. And in fact, here's my phone number in West Berlin. If you call me and let me know whether you want to negotiate seriously. They called him. They negotiated seriously the following day, and the two spies were released, and they walked past each other on a bridge between East and West Berlin in January of '62. So there I was myself a year later, sitting in my jail cell, and when they came back in it an hour later, I said, I'll tell you what, I want to talk to Ivan Shishkin. He has the innocuous title of Second Secretary of the Soviet Embassy, but in fact he's head of the whole KGB for Europe, and my father knows him well, and I insist on going to speak to Ivan Shishkin right now. And so that really confused them to the point where they went out for a few minutes, and I could hear them talking in German just outside the door. Next thing I knew, they came in, picked me up physically, marched me down a hallway to where the tourists were waiting online, and just about shoved me across that border without my even having to show a passport. There is an objective reality in our practical situations, and there is an objective reality in our overall life situations and the life situations of all people and all nations, regardless of whether we are perceiving it at any given time. But it's not a source of fear, it's a source of reassurance, far more so than all our private calculations can devise.